Welcome into the midweek mailbag presented to you by Fantasy Points. My name is Nick Skrip. I'm your host on the show every single week, taking questions from either Twitter or our Fantasy Points subscriber Discord and answering them here. We are heading into week 11. We're still trucking along in the fantasy world. Lots has happened. We had some unfortunate injuries this past week. We've seen some player role changes. A lot of people have a lot of questions on how to address their lineups moving forward, especially with that push for the fantasy playoffs. If you are watching this show on YouTube by chance and you are not a subscriber to Fantasy Points, make sure to become one. Even at this point of year, we have that subscriber Discord that I mentioned, and not only do people ask questions in there to be featured on this show, but we have the Fantasy Points staff analysts in there interacting with all these subscribers on a daily basis. And the site has non-stop content plugging into it, and everything you're looking for when it comes to the fantasy world can be found on fantasypoints.com. So all of our questions today are from that subscriber Discord. We'll kick things off with Drew Wright 14, who asks, what do I do with George Kittle? Can you still trust starting him? So we did have a down week. George Kittle, just 3.10 fantasy points versus the Chargers. 2 targets is not ideal on the box score when you're just looking at that. San Francisco got the dub in this one, which meant Kittle was being more effective as a blocker. It may be frustrating and inconsistent, but there's too much upside to me when it comes to George Kittle for you to bench him or trade him away for the lower or anything like that, unless you have a consistent second tight end. The words consistent and tight end don't exactly go hand in hand all the time. Kittle had over 12 fantasy points the 3 weeks prior to week 10. There are only 4 tight ends who are averaging 12 or more fantasy points on the year. One of those tight ends, Dallas Goedert, just got banged up, is going to miss time. So it's actually good for the position that he's had these weeks of scoring above 12 fantasy points, because consistently not a lot of tight ends are actually doing that. Week 6 and 7, he had a combined 19 targets, 83 and 98 receiving yard days in those 2 games. While we've seen, a low floor out of him, we've seen a couple games of like under 5 fantasy points. There's not many players in the league with the upside he brings for that specific position. So I feel like the risk is worth the reward to me. Just knowing that not a lot of tight ends are averaging good fantasy points weekly. And also when you're looking at a guy like George Kittle, we've seen the upside in receiving yards on a given day, and the upside in scoring touchdowns, and the yards after catch, and those sort of abilities that he brings to the game. So again, it's going to be a rocky ride at times with him and how that system operates. But again, not a lot of guys are bringing consistent upside to begin with, or upside alone. So I'd say if you have George Kittle, unless you have a guy in your bench, you have, I don't know, a guy like maybe Gerald Everett or something that you're comfortable playing, and you can sell Kittle for a running back or wide receiver that's going to make your team better the rest of this redraft season, then maybe. But otherwise, just roll with the ups and downs with him. Next on the list, Cardinal 1B. Will Skowronek take over for Kupp? Seems like the LA Rams offense is going to be even worse now. So we know that Cooper Kupp has that injury that's going to take him out of the mix for a while here. Who knows if he actually is going to come back this season? I guess it probably depends on if the Rams go on a series of wins here and can be a team that sneaks into the playoffs. But if not, you'd have to question, do they force their veteran wide receiver, who's not the youngest of guys, to come back if he's not 100%? But I'm sure there will be a lot of finger pointing when it comes to who's going to absorb those vacated Cooper Kupp targets. He had 98 on the year through 9 games. Skowronek, who's being asked about, had 7 targets last game, but caught 2 of them. Week 5, he had 8 and was efficient, catching 6 of them. He had a 16.7 fantasy point. Week 6, aided by a rushing touchdown. Van Jefferson has worked back into the mix following his knee surgery earlier this season that landed him on the IR. He scored a touchdown in Week 10, 8 targets across his last 2 games. Allen Robinson has averaged 5.2 targets per game on the year, 2 games of 15, plus fantasy points, but he's also had 6 games under 9. The people who pointed at Chicago being the reason he declined in the scapegoat for him last season might be questioning that, just kind of seeing the fantasy season that Allen Robinson's had this year. But, mentioning these other wide receivers, I'm going to focus on Tyler Higbee. Opened up the season heavily targeted. He had these targets across the first 5 weeks: 11, 9, 4, 14, 10. Number 3 for tight ends in targets, receptions, and yards after the catch right now. Yet to score a touchdown, but that's going to come with the volume. So I look at Higbee as a guy who has had 3 games of 10-plus targets, and I think he can get a bump, right back up into being a guy that is consistently targeted at a pretty high level. So everybody else on this list, these other wide receivers I mentioned, big question marks. Nobody's going to become Cooper Kupp from that wide receiver room, in my opinion. So when I'm looking at, who gets the best fantasy bump, I think it's Tyler Higbee, just because we've seen him targeted at a good rate. Now we can see those high target numbers be a little bit more consistent. And I think that he's shown a true connection with Matt Stafford, and also has had a lot of good weeks this year. So I think he's the brightest piece of this puzzle right now. When it comes to the non-Allen Robinson wide receivers, they're going to be on waivers. They should be on waivers right now. I wouldn't be spending a ton of fab on either one of them, in all honesty. I guess it depends on what sort of depth your league has, but don't expect Van Jefferson to be a 12 target wide receiver rest of season or anything like that. So Tyler Higbee gets the bump for me. Next on the list, Lord_Teets. Is Keenan Allen worth keeping? So Keenan Allen, super frustrating year. He appeared in 2 games, but in those 2 games, he only played 33 and 32% of the snaps due to injuries. A lot of us thought he would be healthy following the bye, but he had a setback during that bye week to that hamstring injury. A lot of people will look at a veteran wide receiver in this sort of situation and start saying things like he's washed and he's injury prone, etc. But Keenan Allen from 2017 through 2021 has played in 16 games, all but 2020, where he played in 14. So it's not like he's, traditionally missed a lot of game time or anything like that the last few years. Obviously, he's not the youngest wide receivers anymore, but it's not like he's got this big track record of injuries. 2017 through 2021, he's ranged from 136 up to 159 targets, with 4 of those seasons above 1,196 receiving yards. There is risk for sure with holding him in redraft. Maybe he doesn't play this year. I mean, that's the riskiest part of it. Maybe he gets shut down. He doesn't play this year. It's situational though for me. If you are comfortable, with where you are at in your fantasy league, and you're making playoffs, maybe you got that first round bye locked in. Maybe you have some good depth at the wide receiver position and you've been fine without Keenan Allen, then I'd say hold. Best case scenario is he is 100% come fantasy playoffs and on form. The worst case scenario is he doesn't play, and that's already what he's been doing for your fantasy team. So if you've been surviving without him, might as well just hold and see if you can get a healthy Keenan Allen in the playoffs. Situational on the opposite end, though, if you are chasing that playoff spot right now, you need production, right? You need guys that are actually coming in and scoring fantasy points for you weekly. This week, if he continues to not practice, you have to try to cut ties. So I'm looking at that guy that has some great wide receiver depth. He's going to make playoffs for sure. And I'm having that conversation. Hey, I need 2 guys to produce right now. 2 flex worthy guys. Would you take Keenan Allen for those 2 guys? He could be a guy that can be useful to you in the playoffs. I don't know if I'm going to even make the playoffs. It could be that sort of back and forth conversation. You don't have to be a used car salesman, but sometimes you can kind of paint the picture of how this can help both of us. Without overselling it. I would hate to drop. So I'm always a proponent of trying to make a deal right before your trade deadline. I tell this to people all the time. People are always like, here I have 4 great wide receivers that everybody's going to want if I drop them, but I have to drop one. Well, make a trade. So maybe you have Keenan Allen plus something for one player that, make sure that it's a return for you that keeps you competitive. Don't just drop players and give freebies to your league. So again, if you're in that spot, you're chasing a playoff spot, he's not playing, you need production, then you need to try to be active and make a move. But I would see how the practice goes this week. But you can't win the league at the end of the day without making playoffs. So situational for when it comes to what to do with Keenan Allen. All right, Maddie B, CMC ... no longer bell cow ? What's his rest of season outlook? So 18 total touches for Christian McCaffrey, pretty good. Healthy. That's a healthy 17.7 fantasy point week. He scored a touchdown. 4 of those touches were catches. The big concern that a lot of people were talking about is that Elijah Mitchell also had 18 touches on the dot, all being on the ground. He rushed for 89 yards in his return back from the IR. So he had a pretty good day for missing time and coming right back. This may have caused panic to managers who want CMC to get 25 touches a game, and they're thinking this is a committee now, and he's not a workhorse. For the first time in a while, the core of in San Francisco of those 2 running backs, Debo, actually it's the first time ever if you think about it, CMC, Mitchell, Debo, Ayuk, and Kittle, they were all in the field coexisting together. So having that full boat and still getting 18 touches for Christian McCaffrey, I feel like that's perfectly fine to me. Mitchell taking carries may actually prolong CMC this season because I feel like this is a guy that has had these injuries the last 2 years. This is a team that probably has some contender aspirations, and having Mitchell take some of that workload off of McCaffrey might prolong his season, which could be good for the San Francisco 49ers and your fantasy team. Another reason not to sell CMC is due to what he does with the workload he gets. Huge receiving upside. We know he's one of the best receiving running backs in the NFL. He's a threat to score on the ground. He's a threat to score in the air. I'd take 15 touches from CMC over 20 to 22 touches from a lot of other running backs in this league. So obviously there's a cap to his total volume, his total work. But again, probably prolonging his season for one. Number 2, he's very productive with the work that he does get. Again, 15 McCaffrey touches is very different than, 20, I don't know, Raheem Mostert, touches or something along those lines. But McCaffrey, I'd say don't panic sell right now. If you are super deep at running back and you have this window of like, hey, you know what, I could really use a wide receiver for the rest of the year. I got these other guys. I drafted Ramondre Stevenson late. I got Jeff Wilson off of waivers. I drafted Dameon Pierce late. I also had McCaffrey. I don't know if that's realistic or not, but again, a lot of these questions are very situational because everybody's teams are built different. But I think the big picture here is don't panic sell Christian McCaffrey. So we have the last question for this episode. Team Memphis. Who are some good trade targets with the trade deadline fantasy playoffs approaching? It's a great question because I myself have been looking at this nonstop because I'm in a few leagues right now where this is the last week. And I don't just say this to say this. I am a very avid fantasy player. I get too much into some of my leagues and I make a lot of trades and I make a lot of trade offers and I have a lot of negotiations. It's my whole play to win, which is behind me, my podcast that's outside of this fantasy points realm. But I do a lot of trading and I've done a lot of trading this week. So I've been trying to identify some good targets. I had my own podcast episode last week for the P2W fantasy podcast that mentioned some trade targets. I actually had some analysts give me some clips of some of their targets, which was pretty cool. But I'm just going to roll through some examples of names. So I spoke on Tyler Higbee already. I feel like if you don't have Kelsey or Andrews or TJ Hawkinson, maybe Kittle, who we mentioned, maybe Schultz. If you don't have one of those guys, and I feel like Tyler Higbee, if you feel you are a contender this year, is a good trade target. Tough because you have to find windows sometimes when it comes to trading to buy guys who have signs of performing but may not have had the the great production lately. I said last week in a video regarding Chris Godwin and Amon-Ra St. Brown that both of those guys, for example, had some down fantasy weeks. They weren't performing up to expectations, but they had a ton of volume coming in consistently. So those were guys you can identify and say, hey, I got to make this move now because I don't think their trade value is where it probably should be just because the production hasn't been there. And then both went off in week 10. So now their trade value goes up. So timing is always important in identifying guys whose price might have dipped, but probably shouldn't have dipped. Another guy that comes to mind, Tyler Boyd, still without Jamar Chase. He could be a good flex pickup to give you a bump who likely isn't going to cost you, the structure of your roster. You're not going to have to pay a crazy amount of your roster capital to go and get Tyler Boyd, who's averaging around 13 fantasy points this year, and that's counting a lot of games that Jamar Chase and T. Higgins were both in the mix for. So I feel like Tyler Boyd's had a pretty good season. I feel like him and Hayden Hurst are guys that can get a good bump in target share with Jamar Chase out of the mix. We know what T. Higgins can do, but if you're looking for a reliable flex, I feel like Tyler Boyd can be that guy. Donovan Peoples-Jones, he's been floating around 11, 12-ish fantasy points for a while. Might still be on waivers. He was just on my waiver video this morning. Has some receiving yard upside with a chunk of 70-plus receiving yard games. I think he's been pretty streaky with doing that a lot lately. He's eventually going to get Deshaun Watson. He might be free or cheap to pick up. You might be able to make a trade where he's not the focus of the trade. He's just an add-in from the other guy to get a different deal done. So obviously his teammate Amari Cooper is a guy who's had great weeks. He just had a down week, but he's coming off of a bad game, so maybe you can capitalize on that. But Donovan Peoples-Jones, I feel like, is free or super, super cheap right now, and he's going to get Deshaun Watson, and has shown us to be, pretty consistent in the receiving yard department as of late. Dalton Schultz is back on track. He's been trending up with his usage, fantasy scoring. He's getting away from that knee injury that's held him back this season. The tight end position, we talked about it earlier, is super thin. I think he's a guy that just had another good week, and it's going to get harder to trade for him. But again, if you're looking, he probably doesn't cost the same as Travis Kelce, right? Jalen Waddle, I don't know how expensive he is in your league. He's averaging like 17 fantasy points per game, but sometimes he gets kind of held in the shadow of these big Tyreek Hill games. So maybe you can shoot your shot on a guy like Waddle if you have a running back that has been producing highly that you can do without, and that manager needs a running back desperately, which I myself do in a league or two. Jacoby Myers is consistently targeted, 3 games above 18 fantasy points. He missed 2 weeks. Not a super hot name, though. He's a guy that's an important piece of that Patriots offense. He's really the only wide receiver you can trust over there. And again, we're looking at names like him and Tyler Boyd. If you have these guys in your flex every week, I think you're in a decent spot because I feel like they're pretty reliable. They're going to have their down weeks, but they've shown some upside this season to score, both of those guys, like 18 fantasy points on a given day. Tyler Lockett is quietly a top 10 option that seems to get no love. We love Geno Smith. We love DK Metcalf. We love Kenneth Walker. I rarely see anybody talking about Tyler Lockett, though. And I feel like, again, in redraft, sometimes people put their dynasty caps on and look at an older veteran and don't think, he's an important piece of their puzzle to win a championship. But in reality, again, overall fantasy points, he's been a top 10 guy. 3 straight games with a touchdown. He's been solid. He's got a good connection with Geno. He didn't have high expectations coming in, so it's not like the manager who drafted him in the 2nd or 3rd round and are holding on to that sunk cost of the draft capital. The list can go on there. Just some guys, but you can kind of see where my head's going at. With some of these guys, like targeting certain tight ends because the position is thin. Targeting guys that are not super sexy names that are veterans, like Jacoby Myers. I didn't mention, but like Cordero Patterson is another guy. He had a bad week, but we've seen him score 18 plus fantasy points in 50% of the games he's appeared in this season. Like Patterson, Lockett, like these veterans that don't get a ton of love, but can help you get a little bit of a push towards that playoff or actual championship there. If guys are in the shadow on their own team of somebody bigger, I mean, Devonta Smith had a decent week, but there was weeks where, everybody's talking about A.J. Brown and Devonta Smith dipped a little bit in production, and then he brought it right back up. You can kind of like capitalize on that. Donovan Peoples-Jones, he's going to get a quarterback upgrade. I mean, we can go on and on with this list, but that's kind of where my head's at on different ways I look for trade targets, because everybody wants Justin Jefferson, and everybody wants Saquon Barkley, but to go and get those guys versus like identifying the guys whose price tags are not super, super high can really help you win a fantasy championship. But thank you guys for tuning in. Hope you guys enjoyed the show. We do this every single week. We, as in Fantasy Points Crew, put it out on YouTube, so you can catch this specific show around the same time every single week through this fantasy season. You can find me on Twitter at P2W Fantasy. Always trying to help you guys play to win. Good luck this week.